Hello guys, welcome back to another video, and today is part 4 of my review of the upcoming cards for the Covert Operations expansion, coming out June 11th, so just a couple days away. And this is the batch of cards that came out, or have been revealed, I should say, from I think around June 3rd to the date of recording, June 8th at around noon. The cards are now being revealed at a very rapid rate, so I have about 18 cards here to show off today. And now, not all of these. There are some cards that have been revealed that I'm not going to look at today, specifically the Retribution cards, because there is a pool of 12 Retribution cards and 11 have been revealed so far, so I'm just going to wait until the 12th one is revealed, and then talk about all of them sort of together. That way I don't have to, like, piece between all of them across multiple videos. But anyways, let's just jump straight into the cards. We have a lot of interesting ones here today. We have a lot of develop, and a couple cards that are going to be that are going to be some brain twisters that are going to create some decks. Are going to be really, really fun. So let's roll the intro and get into these.
What a performance there by J King.
J King, full plot armor.
J King is pushing himself into the ranks of the legend.
J King is our world champion! J King 7! What? The back-to-back Cards world champion!
Alrighty, so the first card up, we're starting with Britain. We have Sea Embargo, which is a 2-cost British order, standard rarity. Give a target unit +1/+2. If it is an air unit, develop a British air unit with 2 or less attack. So, this is obviously meant to be a Brit air type of card. Like, you want to be playing, say, Swordfish on turn 1, Sea Embargo it on turn 2, and it turns into a 2/5, and that's pretty good. The issue with that is it can't attack immediately, but it then develops you into another British air unit with 2 or less attack, and often this is going to cost cheap, so it's going to then fit into your curve if you're playing Sea Embargo on turn 2 or turn 3. However, there's also some more expensive British air units with 2 or less attack. Notice, I'm thinking of there's the Blackburn Skua, 4-cost, deal 1 damage if it's a unit, pin it. There's the Barracuda, the big version of the Skua. It's a 5-cost 2/3 bomber, deal 2 damage to a target if it's a unit, pin it. Those both have 2 or less attack. However, they do cost much more than 2. They cost 4 and 5 respectively. Whereas you also have the Swordfish, the Gladiator, the Albacore. You're gonna have the Buffalo, the Kitty Hawk, the 1/2 bomber that buffs unit attack. You're gonna have the new 1/2 bomber that deals damage when you play it. So there's gonna be some really solid options. I think this is a fine Brit air card. The one issue with this card is it's competing with close air support, and this is worse than close air support. This is substantially worse than close air support. Close air support is 1 credit for +3/+3. This is 2 credits for +1/+2 and another unit you can play later. Possibly later that turn if you have the credits, but you know, it's a unit that you are not necessarily running in your deck, and you're not necessarily going to be able to play it immediately that turn. So this is competing with Cass because you don't want too many buff cards in your deck. You want a healthy balance of units and cards that buff units. If you have too many cards that buff units, you're not going to hit your units consistently enough, and you're going to be stuck with these big hands of like 3 Sea Embargoes, 3 close air supports, and no units to play any of them on. Now, Sea Embargo does create additional units, in theory, so that sort of makes up for that, but again, if you don't have a British air unit in your hand to start dumping Sea Embargoes on, then you're kind of in a tough situation, and again, Cass is just better. Cass is higher tempo, Cass is more value in terms of, like, well, I suppose it could be less value, but you are guaranteed that value on the board immediately. I feel like there's a lot of situations where you're going to play Sea Embargo on something, develop a unit, and then you're never going to have the opportunity to play that unit because you're playing Brit Air and you're just going to get blown off the board, or you're going to win without necessarily needing that unit. So all of this being said, I think you could very easily play like 1 or 2 Sea Embargoes on top of a regular 4-cast Brit Air list. I do not think you're going to be running 4 Sea Embargoes in Brit Air unless something drastic changes in the way Brit Air is built, but at the moment, I think maybe this is a 1 or a 2 of. However, it's a fun card to play around with. Also importantly, it is a +1/+2 to any unit type, and straight stat buffs to any unit type are pretty rare. So that's obviously you can play it on a bomber, but you could also play this on an artillery. You wouldn't develop the British air unit, but you know, +1/+2 on an artillery, it can sometimes be pretty good. So if you're building Brit Air with stuff like 2-pounder, then, you know, maybe Sea Embargo is fine, because unlike close air support, you can play this buff without requiring a British air unit on the board. You'll just lose out on the value. So let's get to the next British card that has been revealed. It is Infiltrate, a 5-cost British order, limited rarity. So you can run 3 of these in your deck, and it is Intel 2. Each friendly commando deals damage to a random enemy equal to known enemy cards. So this is an absolutely insane effect. This is the new Commando's win condition now that Commonwealth is gone. And I mean, sometimes Commandos didn't even run Commonwealth, but, you know, they did sort of lack for a win condition. Infiltrate is the win condition. So for each commando you have on the board, this on its own will deal 2 damage per commando to a random enemy, and then also trigger any of your commando's pings. So this is additionally to your pings. So say you have 3, just the regular 2/1 commando that deals 1 damage when you cast an order, and then you play Infiltrate, you are going to be dealing 2 random damage 3 times, and then 1 random damage 3 times, which in total is 9 damage. Like, if the opponent has no units on the board, that's 9 damage to the HQ. That's not a lot. Like, obviously, it's much better than Bismarck, but not a lot. But what if you then play a second Infiltrate? Well, the second Infiltrate is going to be dealing 4 each. So then that's an additional 12 plus the 3 pings. So that's an additional 15 on top of the 9. So suddenly you dealt 24 damage. And that's going to kill most players. However, what if you have been playing Intel cards throughout the game? What if you're playing cards like Resourcefulness, which is Intel 1 Dry Commando from your deck? That seems pretty good. Well, let's say you have 4, 5, 6, let's say 6 Intel on your opponent's hand. You play a couple commandos, you play Infiltrate, that's going to be dealing 8 damage per commando. So you have your 3 commandos, or you don't even say it's a completely empty board. Completely empty board, but you have Intel 6 on your opponent's hand. You play Commando, 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 Infiltrate, and you've just dealt 27 damage to your opponent's face. Infiltrate is a crazy card, and it's a good thing that it's a limited, because I think if this was a standard, you'd probably want to run 4 of these. With Infiltrate as limited, you're probably going to want to be running 3 of these in most Commando decks. It does require some amount of building around. You're going to want additional Intel cards beyond just Infiltrate. However, there is some Intel cards that fit naturally into Commandos, and then some other Intel cards that aren't going to be too out of place in Commandos, something like an Agency Africa, or the ORPs, the 3-cost ORP. I'm not Polish, I'm not going to try to pronounce that. But yeah, this is a crazy card, and what's also very important about this card is it doesn't require the ping commandos. This doesn't require the 2-1s, this doesn't require the 3-3s, this is any commando. And as we saw in the last video, they revealed the 1-cost standard 1/1 commando, the one that reduces a enemy's unit's health to 1. Which means you can dump those for very, very cheap. Like, say you just have a board of, like, you know, you 1 or 2 of your regular commandos. For very, very cheap, you can play out 2 of the 1/1 commandos, maybe play like a Bloody Sickle or something to then remove those units from the board, and then you play Infiltrate, and you have 4 commandos in your support line. That is well within the realm of possibility. So again, the more commandos you can stack on the board, the more damage this is dealing. The more intel you can stack on your opponent, the more damage this is dealing. This is an incredible card. This can be just a ludicrous burn win condition, especially if you can stack 2 on the same turn. Or you can just use this as a board clear. Like, you know, if you're dealing 5, 6, 7, 8 damage to a unit, it's probably going to die. So if you're able to cast Infiltrate on a very big board from like a mid-range deck, and your commando pings hit the right places, you can just absolutely annihilate the board. And mid-range decks aren't great at removing the smoke-screened commandos. So yeah, this could be a very, very, very powerful card. This could put commandos onto the map. Obviously, just having a big win condition does not make the deck great. You need to be able to survive to get there. You need other tools on top of your Infiltrates, because if you have an empty board, your opponent has killed all of your commandos, Infiltrate's doing absolutely nothing. So it's a win more card, but you win so much more. It's a good win more card. But we will need to test how to build it, what's the best ally for commandos, and that's always a fun question because there's a lot of different ways to build commandos with different allies. So yeah, I'm very excited for all of the theory crafting and deck building that's going to be happening around commandos and around Infiltrate. It's going to be very, very interesting, and I'm looking forward to it. Then we get on to German cards. There's quite a lot of German cards that we're going to be looking at here today. Starting with Recuperation, which is a 2-cost order, standard rarity. Give a unit +2 attack. If it is pinned, remove pin and give it +4 attack instead. So this is sort of a card along the lines of Rally, which is the 2-cost German order. Remove pin, or give all friendly units +1 attack and remove pin. This is substantially worse than Rally in almost every single way, because, actually, I forgot to mention, Rally then also draws a card. So Rally unpins all of your units and also draws a card. This unpins one unit and gives it more attack than Rally does, but it doesn't draw a card, and it's only one unit. So unless that unit is completely winning you the game or trading out with the opponent's largest unit that's about to win them the game, this is just not that good of a card. Now, it is just a straight +2 attack if it isn't pinned, and again, this can go on any unit type, so this could be +2 attack, permanent buff to an artillery, but that's not good. That's something Germany didn't really have before, but again, that's not really good enough. So unless there's some wild deck where you're willing to play Recuperation for +2 attack against most decks, and then the second part of it is just a positive upside that's going to make you even better into decks that try to pin out your artillery. I imagine this is some sort of artillery deck. Maybe, but I can't imagine that deck being particularly good, so I can't imagine this card being particularly good. The only thing I can think of this is if they bring back Wirbelwind, which is a tank that reads, if this is in the front line, when your opponent deploys a air unit, pin it. And that was, for a long time, a counter to Comet, because if you could get a Wirbelwind to the front line, your opponent couldn't play Comet, because every time they play it, it gets pinned, and then it returns to hand, and then you play it and it gets pinned. However, if they bring back Burst of Fire and they bring back Wirbelwind, the German OTK decks, the German Burst of Fire decks with the Comet, are going to be able to play Comet into the Wirbelwind. You pin the Comet, but then they play Recuperation to unpin it and bring it to 8 attack, and then Burst of Fire to 9 attack, and then they hit you for 18. Yeah, that's never happening. Recuperation's probably not a card you're going to see much of. But then we have Tip of the Spear, and this is a pretty interesting card. So, we've seen Germany has one other card, I forgot its name, but it's the 0-cost countermeasure, suppress, when the opponent plays a unit, suppress it, can target, or can hit covert units. So it was sort of the anti-covert unit card, and at the time I commented that this is pretty interesting because you're taking an anti-new effect card and making it not absolutely suck. If we look at cards like the Mighty Fall, which is just 3-cost, destroy a veteran unit. Absolutely nothing else. If your opponent's not playing a veteran unit, you can never play this card. The card is absolutely atrocious. No one has ever played it. It is garbage. And I commented at the time on the 0-cost countermeasure that, hey, this is pretty good. This is a way to counter the new cards that can also just fit into a deck, even if your opponent's not playing the new card type, the new archetype, etc. Tip of the Spear is exactly like that. So it's a 4-cost limited German order. Destroy target unit with 3 or less, or with cost 3 or less, can target covert units. So every covert unit costs 3. So this is just 4 credits, destroy a covert unit, or destroy any other type of unit that costs 3 or less. Now, Flying Bomb, which is the first stage of German research, which is destroy a unit that costs 3 or less, and first stage of research costs 3, so it's essentially 3 credits, destroy a unit that costs 3 or less. That's an incredibly popular option off of Flying Bomb, and Flying Bomb was run in basically every single German deck ever. Or German research was run in every single German deck ever, including some aggro decks would run it and only ever pick Flying Bomb. They would literally play it for Flying Bomb. Now, this is 1 credit more, and 1 credit when it comes to removal is kind of a big deal, but I could see a world where German Control is just running 1 or 2 Tip of the Spears as just good removal. You know, it's better than Tactical Strike in a lot of situations. It's worse than Tactical Strike in a lot of situations, but people have been trying to Tactical Strike lately, and Tip of the Spear, it can be much better than that. It can take out the buffed 35Ts off of the Panzergrens. It can, you know, remove the 0-4s, but I suppose Tactical Strike could do that as well. It's going to be able to take out all of those buffed up commandos. And it's going to be able to take out any annoying covert units that your opponent's playing. And, that's just good enough. Like, I think this card might just be good enough removal that you're going to run this with the upside that it's really, really good if your opponent's playing covert stuff. And that's exciting. Like, this is sort of like what the Mighty Fall should have been. It's an anti-covert card that you can run realistically in a real deck, and that's really cool. So yeah, I'm gonna definitely be trying out Tip of the Spear. And yeah, I think it's a cool card. Then we get on to a very interesting card. So we get to Blitz Doctrine, which is a 1-cost special German order. Develop a German light tank. Add Contest Doctrine to your hand. So first of all, let's deal with the first sentence of this. Develop a German light tank. What does this mean? A German light tank is any German tank that costs 3 or less. So this could be a 38T, a 35T, the Panzer 3F, the Stug 3F, the Panzer 2A. There's a lot of German tanks that cost 3 or less. So this is just 1 credit, develop a German tank that costs 3 or less. That on its own, not really good. Like, it's a card that maybe they could print, but it's not a card you'd ever run at Heinz. You would just rather run a card that costs 3 or less that you are choosing to put into your deck and not paying the extra credit to get. However, then we get to the second sentence, which is add Contest Doctrine to your hand. And Contest Doctrine is the second card here on your screen, which is a 3-cost German order, and this is not a card you can put in your deck. The only way to get Contest Doctrine is off of Blitz Doctrine, but it costs 3 credits, and it says develop a German medium or heavy tank, and this is just any tank, German tank that costs 4 or more. So you can get King Tiger, you can get the Panzer 3G, the Panzer 3H, you can get any number of German tanks that cost 4 or more off of this. Well, not any number, but you develop, so you pick one of 3 random options given to you. And then it says, tanks you deploy this battle get +1/+1. And this is a permanent effect for the rest of the game on all tanks, German or otherwise, that you deploy. And this is really, really good. Because if you can get this off on turn 3, every single tank for the rest of the game that you play is going to have +1/+1. And that is a very big deal. Suddenly your Panzer A's, your Panzer 2A's, the 1/3 tank that is decent in the early game but gets really flimsy towards the later game, it's suddenly going to be a 2/4. And that is a lot better. And that is also, it's going to still cost 1, it's still going to operate for 1. All of the cost stays the same. Every single card just gets +1/+1. That is incredible. And the other thing about this is you can trigger this multiple times. You can get a second Contest Doctrine up to give all of the tanks you deploy for the rest of the game +2/+2. Now granted, that will cost 8 credits to do. It will cost, right now it costs 4 credits, and you develop 2 tanks while you're at it. So it's 4 credits, develop 2 tanks, one that is cheap, one that is expensive. And for the rest of the game, your units get +1/+1. That is, a 4 credit tempo hit is a big deal in Heinz if you're against any sort of mid-range deck or aggro deck, where Heinz can already kind of struggle on tempo. If you just spend 4 credits doing nothing on the board, you're probably going to lose that game, even if you're playing big tanks later in the game. But if you're playing Heinz against a control deck, you are more than happy to just spend the first couple turns, you play Blitz Doctrine, maybe you throw out a tank on turn 2, and then you play Contest Doctrine on turn 3. And by that point, Control has probably done basically nothing. Maybe they've deployed a guard or something. And then just every unit for the rest of the game you play as +1/+1, and you're going to try to find the second Blitz Doctrine as quickly as possible, so that every German tank you play for the rest of the game gets +2/+2, and then you're going to try to leverage those stats to beat out Control that honestly typically beats Heinz, because Heinz can struggle with just keeping up with guard units, trying to get through these big guard units. They have the Blitzkrieg, but, if you can't set up a good enough front line, it can be difficult to get through these very chunky high health units, because Heinz's units tend to be kind of flimsy. And Contest Doctrine is the perfect solution to this. So I think you will run 2 Blitz Doctrines in Heinz, just because it is such a good card against any slower matchup. However, I think you're not going to keep it in the mulligan or play it on turn 1 unless you have no other choice. Against against like Japan aggro, US frontline, probably it's a bit too slow to try to get this out on turn 3. But again, like maybe against the front line, for example, if they have a bit of a slow start, or maybe you go first and you're able to get a Panzer A into the front line, maybe you can drop a Contest Doctrine on turn 3 or turn 4, and you'll take a massive tempo hit. You'll probably lose the front line, but then maybe that +1/+1 that's going to like open up a whole new range of value trades for the rest of the game. It's going to be enough to bring you back into the game. And the other thing I want to note about this is not tanks in your hand and deck get +1/+1 for the rest of the game. This is tanks you deploy. So tanks you generate off of additional developing from Blitz Doctrines or Contest Doctrines, or the 35T you get off of Panzer Grenadiers. Those are also all going to have +1/+1 as well. It doesn't have to be, as long as it is not being created on the board, like as long as this is not a summon effect, or an add effect, if it is deployed from your hand and it's a tank, it will then get the +1/+1. So yeah, very, very powerful card. This is going to be a staple in Heinz. But you could even run this in just sort of a tank-themed mid-range deck, or a tank-themed even, like, control deck almost, where you're not necessarily playing the largest number of tanks. You're not necessarily playing, like, 25-plus tanks. But, you know, maybe you're just running, like, 15 tanks, and then you have 2 Blitz Doctrines, but the tanks you're running are a bit on the heavier side. They might have a deployment effect, like maybe running some Flam Panzers. You know, the Panzer H classic control card to get the draw. You know, maybe you're just playing a couple of these, and that's good enough to run 2 Blitz Doctrines, just because it can function like card draw in a control deck almost, because you're getting 2 tanks for 4 credits. That's similar to a 4 credit draw 2 cards, and then you're also getting this additional effect that both the tanks get +1/+1, and all other tanks get +1/+1 for the rest of the game. So yeah, Blitz Doctrine, absolutely crazy card. I wouldn't be super surprised if this card gets nerfed in the future. Probably a credit nerf to one of these 2 steps. Like probably a 4 credit Contest Doctrine. I wouldn't be that surprised if that happens either in the first patch immediately after the expansion, or the second patch. I would bet one of those 2, because I could see this slipping under the radar of the first patch if stuff like self-credit denial is far too strong and just dominating the meta and no one's playing Germany. However, I definitely think by the second balance patch we're probably going to see this card toned down, because this seems absolutely insane to me. Then we get to a Kurmark Aufklärung. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. It is a 3-cost, 3/3 infantry special rarity for Germany with Alpine. So Germany's gotten another Alpine card. With deployment, choose a countermeasure in your hand, activate it at the end of your turn. So essentially this is just a way to cheat out a credit, or like cheat out credits exclusively spent on a countermeasure, which is a really, really bad way to cheat out credits, because 1, it requires the countermeasure to be in your deck, 2, it requires the countermeasure to be in your hand, and then 3, if it requires your opponent to trigger the countermeasure on the turn you hold it up, because if they don't, then you're not really using those credits. So, you know, this is probably, if you're playing a countermeasure deck, this is going to be a good card in it, because it can help you also hide what options it might be. So you could play this and then end your turn with 0 credits held up, and your opponent doesn't know if they need to play around a 5 credit a bridge too far, if they need to play around a 3 credit envelop, a 2 credit from the deep, you know, like a 4 credit Night Hunters. Like this card does help hide what you are spending your credits on in a countermeasure deck. And there's a couple countermeasures that you might want to run in Alpine. I have seen Alpine decks build around with Night Hunters. Obviously there was Decisive Defense, but that's been rotated now. But, you know, maybe you want to, like, run this with a bridge too far or something. That doesn't seem good to me, but it seems like people are going to try it, just because this does have Alpine. The Alpine part of it does seem to be somewhat insignificant, because Germany has the 3-cost 4/3 Alpine, vanilla. So if you're not using a countermeasure in your deck, you're not running this card. But, you know, maybe this is going to get people to try out countermeasure Alpine. I don't think that's going to be good. I think that's probably going to be worse than regular Alpine. But, you know, it's fun. And I want to point out a specific thing about the wording. The reason it says activate at the end of your turn, rather than choose a countermeasure in your hand to activate, is because you can unactivate a countermeasure to get your credits back, which means you could play this otherwise. You can't do this because of the way it's worded. But if it wasn't worded this way, what you would be able to do is play this on turn 3 and activate a bridge too far, and then unactivate a bridge too far to gain 5 credits. So you would basically be able to cheat this out for free and gain 2 credits on turn 3 if you have this and a bridge too far. Which doesn't sound particularly good because, again, it requires you to have 2 specific specials in your hand and a bridge too far in your deck. And the end result is you get 2 extra credits at a free 3/3 if you hit the nuts, and that doesn't seem like that good on turn 3 for the nuts. But, you know, I guess it's something that they didn't want people to just be able to cheese out Kermark to generate credits in a really weird way, so they changed the wording, and that's probably fair enough. Then we have 2 German elites to look at. The first one is Shifting Attack, a 2-credit German order. Send a friendly unit to owner's hand. I don't know why it's just to owner's hand. I feel like that you're missing a word or two there. It costs 0 credits to deploy this turn. So this is an incredibly powerful card. This is a very, very strong utility card that you're just going to kind of want to put into any German deck ever if you can find the spot for it. So essentially, if a card costs anything less than, like if the card costs 2, you're kind of fine playing this card. Like if a card costs 2 or more and it has a deployment effect or it has blitz, this is a card that you're fine playing it on. So what I mean by this is, for example, you can do, even in an aggro deck, so like the sort of the worst case scenario is you do like 35T attack face, shifting attack, 35T attack face. You basically just turn your shifting attack into a second 35T. It doesn't create a second body, but it can be used to deal an additional 2 damage to get across the line, or maybe the first 35T trades into a 1/2, and then you shifting attack it back to your hand, to heal it back and then play it and hit face, or maybe you shifting attack back to hand and then keep it there, and then play it in the future for Blitzkrieg. Now, it only costs 0 credits less on that turn. If you return it to hand and don't play it, it will go back to its regular cost. But, you know, that's fine. And again, that's sort of like the low end. On the medium end, you can do this on, like, a Panzer H to get another free choose 1 of 3 cards to draw effect. And again, you could heal the 2/4 body. You can do this on a Panzer Grenadiers to get an additional 35T and an additional combined arms, and again, you can do this after trading out with a unit if the Panzer Grenadiers survives. You can do this with a Schützen to re-trigger the veteran effect, and just like deal 4 damage to 2 different units in the front line. Like if your opponent has 2 Showmans in the front line, you can do Schützen, attack, shifting attack the Schützen, Schützen, attack, and you've now dealt 6 damage to the opponent's HQ and removed their 2 Shermans. That's pretty good. And then on the higher end, again, you like on the more expensive end of things, you can repeat like the draw effect on FW. Jägerbomber got rotated, but if Jägerbomber wasn't rotated, you would absolutely be shifting attack Jägerbomber. And then you have sort of the wild end in more towards German control, where you can do this on, say, a Leopold, where you play Leopold, and then you shifting attack Leopold back into your hand, so that you're able to Leopold again in the future. Or you might have played Leopold, your opponent sent everything back to hand, your opponent floods the board, and then on the next turn you attack with Leopold, and then shifting attack it back to your hand, and then you play it again for free to send everything back again. This is a very, very powerful card. It has a number of different situations. There is also some amount of combo potential for this card, because again, you can do Comet, attack face, shifting attack, Comet back to hand, replay Comet, attack face. Now that's not like, it's an amount of burst damage, it's not really a combo, and with Burst of Fire rotated, I find it difficult to imagine that you're going to be able to find an effective combo for this, because again, the only real, like, high attack Blitz Fury unit is Shiden, and that's a Japanese elite, this is a German elite, so you can't run them together. But also, this can be played on non-German units, so if you're, you know, you can play this on ally nation cards, so if there's any specific deployment effects that you really want. So for example, like if you're doing German-Italy control, you can do this on a Decima, etc. This is just a very, very powerful card that is very, very high utility, and it's a card that is going to be it's a sort of like a, it's a high skill card in a lot of ways, because you're going to have to balance what the best card in your deck to get to play again. Essentially, is against your opponent's deck. You have to figure out what they're playing, and then try to think about what cards are in your deck, what card is best to shifting attack against their deck, and then you have to balance whether it is worth saving shifting attack for that best case scenario versus playing it immediately for some amount of value in your current position when you draw it. This is going to be a very, very cool card. You're going to see some wild plays with this card. You're going to see some wild lethal, some wild like board clears to save the game, just some wild big brain plays that like top players, tournament players are going to be making, and maybe you can make them too if you pick up shifting attack from your Covert Operations packs. This card I'm very excited about. It's a very simple but very, very cool card. Then we have a 3-cost 2/5 fighter German elite with 2 operation costs, the Dornier. And it says, units you deploy move into the front line if possible. So this is just a really, really odd card. I don't really know how to use this card as intended. Now, there is some things that immediately come to mind. So, for example, the Africa Regiment, which is a 3-cost 3/4 infantry. When this moves to the front line, deal 3 damage to the enemy HQ. It doesn't have Blitz, but if you have Dornier on the board, you can play Africa Regiment, and it will immediately move to the front line if it's empty or you control it, and it will immediately deal the 3 damage to the enemy HQ. And then there is the card that says it's a 3-cost 3/4 infantry. When this moves to the front line, give all units there +2 attack. I'm blanking on its name, but I talked about it in my last video. You can play that and move it to the front line to get immediate +2 attack, but like, you're not going to be building a deck around a 1-of elite unit. And even if you were, like, you play Dornier on turn 3, and then if your opponent just removes it, then your hand is now stuck with all these crappy cards. So, it's not going to be good in the deck that just sort of uses the when moved to frontline cards. That's not how this is going to work. Is it going to be good enough to just sort of run in some of these aggro German decks, some of these mid-range German decks, where, you know, like if you're playing Combined Arms, a 3-cost 2/5 fighter with a positive effect is pretty good if you're playing a Combined Arms deck. Like, it's a fighter that's going to be sticking around, and its effect is essentially just positive. It's you get your units straight to the front line. You're essentially credit cheating if they have operation cost. And if they don't have Blitz, you're also, like, cheating in an extra turn there. This is a very, very powerful effect. It's just a very bizarre effect that's kind of difficult. You can't build your deck around it. However, maybe it's just good enough to fit into these, like, German-type decks, or these German aggro-type decks. Combined Arms, I think there's a very good argument for running this. Mid-range, I think there's a fine argument for running this, like, the German-Japan style than German-US. Heinz, I kind of don't imagine you're going to be running this card in Heinz, because oftentimes in Heinz you're going to want to be keeping a lot of your units in the support line, keep them safe, keep the smokescreen on them, keep them back from dying until you can buff them on a later turn, and even if you do want to push them into the front line, you probably don't want a Dornier in your deck because it has no synergy with any other card in your deck. Your Heinz is a very tank-centric deck, so I can't imagine you're going to be running Dornier. But, you know, if you open Dornier in a pack, maybe there's some fun ways to try it out. I'm sure I'm going to be trying it out. And I'm sure it's going to see some limited tournament play, but this is not a star card. This is not an auto-include by any means. This is just going to be an interesting card to see how it works. Then we get to the only Japan card we're going to be looking at here today, the Kurume Regiment, a 2-cost 3/3 guard special with 2 operation cost. So just before looking at the text, 2 cost, 2 operation, 3/3 guard, special. It's just a solid card. Just a straight up solid card. 2 cost for a 3/3 guard is good, and Japan Control would probably run that because right now Japan Control has no particularly good 2-drops and no particularly good early game guards. So Kurume, without the destruction effect, would probably see play in Japan Control. Now, will Japan Control see play? I don't know. But if it did see play, you would probably run a 2-cost 3/3 guard. Now, what is its additional text? Well, its additional text is destruction end the turn. So what does this mean? Well, it means that whoever's turn it is, when this card dies, that turn is ended. So if it's your turn and you trade out Kurume Regiment, like you control Kurume Regiment, it is your turn, and you take an action that destroys Kurume Regiment, you trade it into a big unit, your turn is immediately ended. However, what's more likely to happen is you play Kurume Regiment and it's a guard, and your opponent can't attack the HQ, so your opponent's going to be, I don't know, say Frontline, Jaegro, Heinz, pick any of the aggro decks. They have a big unit, they have a big front line of units that they want to attack face. You play Kurume Regiment, and now they just cannot attack face, because they first have to kill Kurume Regiment, and killing Kurume Regiment immediately ends the turn. And this isn't sets your credits to 0 and then you can still attack with things that operate for free. This is end turn immediately. So this is a very, very powerful effect. Now, obviously, it's a destruction effect, so it can be suppressed. And your opponent can just spend all of their credits doing stuff before killing Kurume Regiment. But again, a 2-cost 3/3 guard you would probably run in a lot of Japan control decks. So a 2-cost 3/3 guard that sometimes just absolutely ruins your opponent's day is pretty good. Like, that's a step up. And, you know, it can bait your opponent into flooding the board, or your opponent might not want to use their additional credits that they're now just going to waste because of Kurume Regiment, because they don't want to flood the board to play around board clears. And also, there's a world where you can, like, push this up to the front line in a more aggressive style deck, or just when you're taking an aggressive stance in a control deck, where you just get Kurume Regiment to the front line and 2 good units on either side of it, and if your opponent's playing any sort of unit-based deck, they now can't remove those 2 other units because they have to kill Kurume first, which will end their turn, and then guarantee that those 2 other units are able to attack the enemy face or get value trades or whatever you're doing. So Kurume Regiment is a very powerful effect, and it works on the defensive, it works on the offensive. Obviously, there's some really big worries about this card, because if you play this card and your opponent's holding up a Careless Talk, your turn will immediately end because your Kurume Regiment dies. So there's going to be some really funny moments with this card. But I think this card is going to be a great, solid staple in any single at any Japan combo deck, any Japan control deck, probably any Japan mid-range deck. I think you're not going to be running this in the fastest Jaegro decks, but I think there's an argument if you're running sort of more of the slower Jaegro with the Schutzens and the Winter Regiments, I think there's an argument to put Kurume Regiment into that deck. It's just a really, really good card. And, you know, if you can find the slots, you're going to be wanting this in Japan Ally decks as well. Kurume Regiment is just a really, really powerful card. Yeah, what else to say about this? Then we get on to the Soviet cards, and we get what I believe is the first veteran card to be revealed this expansion, so it looks like they are going to be continuing the veteran effect. And this is 392nd Rifles, a 4-cost Soviet infantry, 3/5 body, that reads, give units you deploy +2 attack and deal 1 damage to them. Becomes veteran when it has dealt 4+ damage. Now, I probably should have figured this out before recording this video, but now that I'm reading this, I'm kind of wondering if the deals 4+ damage requires it to be 4+ damage from this card's effect, or if it's just have this unit deal 4+ damage through combined its attack and this effect. So, like, if you play this and then you play 1 unit and deal 1 damage to it, and then you attack a unit for 3 damage, will that be 4 damage becomes veteran, or do you have to play 4 units with this on the board? And then the veteran version is a 5/5 with a passive effect. Your damaged units have +2 attack. So this seems like sort of a damage your own units combo card. Not necessarily a combo card in terms of going off in 1 turn, but it seems like almost like an engine card that you play in your support line. And then you just start spamming out 2 health, cheap blitz units, things like Katyusha, maybe the BT-7, things that can survive taking 1 damage and can immediately attack the enemy. The Catalina that we saw earlier, the 1/3 blitz bomber, you play this, turns into a 3/2 blitz bomber, you're pretty happy with that. And then obviously once you get the veteran version, suddenly all of those damaged units you have all have an additional +2 attack. They all have +4 attack. However, it turns off the dealing damage to your other units effect, so you can't then play additional units without damaging them. So this is a interesting archetype. I don't think it's an archetype that has nearly enough support to exist. Obviously, you could run this with a card like Counteroffensive, which is +2/+1 for every damaged unit on the board. However, normally you run that with Winter Warfare to damage all the units. If you're running a have your units be damaged deck, I don't know if you can afford to run Winter Warfare. And obviously you're damaging your own units with this to buff Counteroffensive, but then you're not damaging the opponent's units with the Winter Warfare, so Counteroffensive gets a bit weird. I can't imagine this deck's going to be particularly good, but, maybe people are going to try it out. There's some interesting questions on what ally nation you use. I could see Germany for cards like Panzer A, because 1/3 Blitz tank turning into a 3/2 Blitz tank. Pretty happy with that. 35T, go from a 2/2 to a 4/1 Blitz. 0 op, pretty good. So this just seems like a pretty solid card to play, and 4 cost for a 3/5 in the support line, not super easy to remove. The other card that came out in this expansion, I'm forgetting what its name is, but it was a 4 cost 4/3 Blitz tank special that has +4 attack when damaged, which means if you play this with a 390, if you play that unit with a 392nd rifles on board, that unit becomes a 10-2 Blitz tank, and 6 to play and operate, 10 to the opponent's face, which means you could theoretically OTK them if they have no guard, the front line is empty, you have a 392nd rifles on board that is not veteran, and then you play 2 of these tanks, and you hit them in the face for 20. Is that ever going to happen? Are you ever not just going to get completely blown off the board in the first 3 turns by a deck like Jaggro, or, locked out of the front line by a deck like US Frontline? Yeah, I can't imagine that this deck is going to be super powerful right now, but you have some really interesting tools that maybe can be pushed in the future, or if other decks sort of get hit by nerfs, or the next expansion's rotation hits other nations more so than Soviets, maybe this is an archetype that could see play in the future, because it has some pretty powerful tools. I just don't think it's there yet. But 392nd is definitely a really cool card that's going to see some theory crafting. Then we have the 186th Recon Company. I don't know why, but I find this card art very amusing. Just the look on his face of the one guy in the big snow coat. But it's a 2 cost 2/3 infantry with a passive effect. When a friendly covert unit is revealed, give your units +1/+1. So if you reveal a covert unit, that covert unit gets +1/+1, this gets +1/+1, and all other cards on your board get +1/+1, except for unrevealed covert units. So this is just a card you throw into the covert deck. You try to do like this on turn 2, covert unit on turn 3. Well, you probably don't actually want to play this on turn 2, because you're not revealing a covert unit until minimum turn 4, so that gives your opponent 2 opportunities to remove this. But you want to play Deuce on turn 1, covert unit on turn 2, 186th Recon, and reveal the covert unit on turn 3. And you might be wondering what the Deuce is. We'll get to that in a second. But yeah, this seems like a solid card that you probably want 2 of in the covert deck. And it just feels kind of snowbally. Like, the entire covert deck sort of feels like if you're in into a matchup where you are going to win, you are going to win really, really hard, like 90% of the time, and if you're against a matchup where you're going to lose very, very hard 90% of the time. It just sort of feels like if your opponent is playing a control deck with lots of orders, you're just going to get a free win, and if your opponent is playing an aggro deck with lots of cheap blitz units, you're going to lose. And this just exacerbates that if you put it into your deck, because this is just a snowball card. Like, it's going to make you snowball harder against decks that can't deal with your covert and sort of give you the room to set up a big early board, and it's going to be too slow against decks like Jaggro that are going to have you down to like 10 health on turn 3. So yeah, it's probably going to see play in covert decks. How good covert decks are going to be, I'm still very, very unconvinced. I imagine a lot of people are going to play them because they're going to beat a lot of decks really, really, like, they're going to absolutely destroy a lot of decks, so people are going to play it, despite it not actually having a particularly high win rate, because it's also going to lose to a lot of decks. Or maybe it's a tournament deck list. You're probably going to see a lot of people playing it anyways, regardless of its win rate. And this card's just going to be in it. Then we get onto the US, and we have quite a few, I think 3 or 4 US cards to look at today. The first one is Hidden Plans, which is a 1-cost US order. Choose one, draw a covert unit, or reveal a covert unit and give it +1/+1. So this is an interesting card. This is also really funny because Soviets have a 4-cost order, I think it's a limited as well, which is play the top covert unit from your deck, which is just objectively worse than this 99% of the time. Unless your opponent is Germany with that very specific anti-covert countermeasure, this is just better than the Soviet one. And the Soviet one is a higher rarity, and it's in the nation that is the covert theme. So this is just kind of bizarre to me, because this is 1 credit, draw a covert unit, and then you can choose to spend your 3 credits on playing the covert unit if you want, and that will result in the exact same thing as 4 credits, play the top covert unit of your deck. However, with this one, if you don't like the covert unit you drew, you can use your 3 credits doing anything else. It also, maybe you play this on a turn where you don't have the 3 credits to play the other covert unit, you just have 1 credit left over, so you play Hidden Plans to draw a covert unit for the next turn. The other thing about this is it's a choose one effect, and the other option has a ton of utility because you can reveal your own covert unit. So for example, you can reveal the US covert if this has been on the board for 2 turns, give all of your units +1/+1. You can reveal that in the support line without necessarily needing to attack to give all your units +1/+1 all across the board, and then it also gets +1/+1. Or maybe it's about to attack and you reveal it to give it +1/+1, and then an additional +1/+1 from its own effect, and then you attack as a 5/6. So it's pretty good. There's also very, very limited situations where maybe you play this on your opponent's covert unit. It will give that unit +1/+1, which is bad for you, but it will reveal it, so maybe it will stop them from getting a game-winning effect, like, getting the T-34 1942. Maybe you can prevent that by Hidden Plans in on their own unit, giving them the buff, but removing the free tank. So this is a very interesting card. This is going to be, again, sort of like one of the more bigger brain cards of the Covert deck, because Covert otherwise just sort of seems to be play units, hope your opponent guesses wrong, and hit face. This is like the only card in the Covert deck that seems to have any amount of thought that goes into it. I know I've seen very negative on the Covert deck, but I am very negative on the Covert deck. I think it's a boring archetype. I hope it's not good, and I'm sad that this is what Soviets got. However, Hidden Plans is a very, very cool card, I will say. Also, I need to correct myself from the previous video. I had previously said that all of the cards that count at the end of your turn, so for example, the US unit that if this has been on the board for 2 turns, give your units +1/+1. The Soviet card, I think it's if this has been on your board 3 turns, get the T-34 1942. There's the guy that gets, I think there's another one, but I'm forgetting it off the top of my head. All of those, I had previously said they trigger at the end of your turn. Like, that is the end of the first turn on board, is at the end of your turn. That is incorrect. It is actually at the start of your turn is the end, like, the start of your turn is the start of its second turn on the board, and then the start of the third turn on the board, which means your opponent will have 2 opportunities to reveal these cards. They will have 2 opportunities to reveal the card that needs to be on the board for 2 turns, 3 to reveal the card that's been on the board that needs to be on the board for 3 turns, etc. Which makes Covert substantially worse. I was mistaken about that previously, as were a number of other people. So, if you see people saying this, correct them, because this incorrect idea has spread about the community a fair amount. So again, it counts at the start of your turn for 1 full turn on the board. You play it, you end your turn, your opponent ends their turn, and then now it is starting its second turn on the board. And then we get to another Covert unit, which is the 394th Infantry Regiment. It is a 3-cost, 1 operation cost. Of course, it's a Covert unit. Standard for US, 4/2 body, with reveal, gets +2/+2 if it is in the front line. So it's a 3-cost, 4/2, that is a 6/4 if it is in the front line when it gets revealed. That is either being attacked or attacking. This seems not particularly good. This seems like probably the worst Covert card we've seen so far. The one good thing about this card is it's a card that you just want to immediately push it to the front line. Like, you want to play this and then push it to the front line on the following turn, whereas there's a lot of other covert cards, which, you know, you kind of want to stick around in the back line to hit the, if it's been on the board, blank number of turns requirements. This one, like, if you played a fully dedicated covert deck, maybe you throw in a couple of these, just to, like, throw them into the front line immediately. This be sort of fodder, be sort of bait for anti-covert cards. But this just seems so bad. If you can't get it to the front line, this card is absolutely atrocious. And even if you can get it to the front line, if you get this to the front line and then you attack with it, you're probably winning the game no matter what covert unit you got to the front line. This beat a 6-4 doesn't really matter. And if you get it to the front line and the opponent attacks into it, they're probably prepared to deal at least 4 damage. I don't think they're going to be surprised by a 6-4 if they attack into a covert unit in the front line. So yeah, this card just seems not particularly good. Then we get to the Deuce, or as I like to call it, the Duce. It is a 1-cost 2/2 US infantry with 2 operation cost, which means the Skytrain just got even worse. They lost Red Devils, and they lost the 1/2 that gets +2 attack for each adjacent unit, and now they are gaining a 1-cost 2/2 with 2 operation cost. You heard it here first. Cut Skytrain. Skytrain is trash now. Do not run Skytrain in the Covert Operations expansion. But what is its effect? So it's a 2/2 with 2 operation costs. With the passive effect, your covert units cost 1 less to deploy, which means you want to play this on turn 1, and then you play a covert unit on turn 2. So you cheat out a covert unit by 1 turn. I hate this card. This card is incredibly powerful. You're going to be running 3 of this in the covert deck, either most likely Soviet-US, but I suppose you could try US-Soviet, or maybe even like US-Japan. But absolutely you're going to be running this card in your deck, because turns out cheating out a card is pretty good. And this, obviously this hits the turn 1 Deuce into turn 2 covert, very, very good. But there's also, say, like the turn 5 Deuce double covert, whereas your alternative is a single covert, 2 credits. What are you going to do with that? This just, credit cheating is just really, really good, and when your entire deck archetype is play covert units, credit cheating on covert units is pretty good. This is just super lazy card design. I hate cheap, your blank cards cost less. This is sort of the issue with Exile, where you're trying to find your Exile units cost 1 less, and then you cheat out a bunch of Exile units as quickly as possible and try to snowball the board into a winning game state. This is just going to be the same thing with covert units, where you try to play the Deuce on turn 1 and then snowball out with as many covert units as possible, because you can do covert unit on turn 2, and then on turn 3 you can play another covert unit, and then operate the covert unit you played on turn 2. It's just going to snowball super hard, and covert units already snowball super hard because they are immune to AoEs until they are revealed. Yeah, this card is just super, super dumb. Like, it's going to be a great card in the covert deck. This card makes the covert deck much better than it would otherwise be. It just makes it better in the worst possible way. Could we stop just making these types of cards, please? 1 credit units that credit cheat are not fun, and they are not interesting. Anyways, moving on to the Scout card. This card is fun and interesting. It is the M20 Scout card, a 1-cost 1/3 Blitz US tank. So same effect as Greyhound, essentially. 1/3 a 1-cost 1/3 1 operation cost Blitz tank. US unit. This one's a limited. With the deployment, target a unit, destruction, it gets +1/+1. So there's some interesting things about this card. Oddly enough, I expected everyone's first reaction to just be like, this card's absolutely insane. It's just strictly better Greyhound for frontline. This is just going to replace Greyhounds in frontline, or at the very least, you run this alongside Greyhounds and it replaces Red Devils in frontline. But oddly enough, a lot of people reacted to saying this card is bad, and I'm going to explain why this card is good and why this card is bad. So first, let's start with why is this card bad. And the reason it is bad is because it says deployment target a unit, not deployment target a friendly unit, which means if you have no units on the board, you must target an enemy unit, which means if you go second and your opponent plays a 1-cost unit on turn 1, you can't play Scout card without targeting their 1-cost unit, and then you end your turn, and then it goes to the opponent's turn, And if they're able to destroy your scout car, you just gave your opponent +1/+1 on turn 1. That is really bad. That is like game-losingly bad a lot of the times if you're in any sort of like tempo mirror. Now, there's a couple of ways to get around this. One, you could just not play scout car on turn 1. You could like pass on turn 1 in worst case scenario. 2, it's kind of difficult for your opponent to kill scout car on turn 2 without trading in the unit they played on turn 1. So, for example, if they do turn 1 cavalry regiment, and then you do turn 1 scout car and target their cavalry regiment, they can do Type 93 and trade with scout car. They can do 35T and double trade with scout car. But in both of those situations, cavalry regiment trades itself out and dies, so scout car does not give it +1/+1. And the other thing is, you know, like if your opponent plays turn 1 cavalry going first, and you have scout car in hand, and you are like worried they're going to kill it with honorable death or something, so you pass. On turn 2, you can do scout car, target the cavalry, and then trade into the cavalry, so the cavalry is now dead, so you don't have to worry about it giving it +1/+1. So it's not the end of the world, but it can be a bit of a hindrance where Greyhound, like with Greyhound, Skytrain is the only unit in your deck that you are going to be using the give +1 attack to units in your support line effect for. Like maybe getting units out of like honorable death range or something. But realistically, you never use Greyhound for anything other than a 1-cost 1/3 blitz US tank. And that is what M20 Scout Car is, with sometimes it is worse than that because sometimes you have to maybe give your opponent buffs. Very, very rarely. However, most of the time, you are going to be giving yourself a buff, which is pretty good. Like, the buff is very difficult to use because you have to target a unit that is on the board, and then you need your M20 Scout Car to die first, and it's not often that you use M20 Scout Car or Greyhound. It's not often you use a 1/3 tank to immediately trade out in a way that that tank dies, just because there's not really 3/1 units in the game. Like, there's not a lot of popular 3/1 units in the game. There's a lot of 2/1s. So you're rarely trading out Scout Car, and if your opponent, it goes to your opponent's turn, they're just going to kill the unit you targeted with Scout Car first, and then kill Scout Car, or play an AoE and kill them both simultaneously. And so I think an important part of Scout Car to think about is, if you don't get the +1/+1, if nothing gets the +1/+1, it's just a Greyhound, and Greyhound has been good enough to be run in US Frontline for like 3 years. If you do get the +1/+1 buff, it's insane. So I don't think people should sort of work around getting this buff. I don't think they should make subpar plays and just spend credits sacking Scout Car in a trade they would not otherwise make just to give the +1/+1. That's going to be incorrect most of the time. Because again, this card doing absolutely nothing is good enough to see play in a competitive tier 1 list. So the fact that it sometimes does something more, if that happens, it's going to be really good. But I think actually most of the time Scout Car is probably not going to buff anything, which is fine. Because, you know, if it did always buff something, this card would be insane. Then we move on to the ally nations. So first up, we have a French card, the 5e Chasseurs, or the 5th Chasers, which is a 5-cost 5/5 infantry special rarity and it has blitz. So 5/5 blitz infantry, pretty good. France has steadily been increasing their number of blitz cards. They have the blitz 3/4 that draws a card if your opponent has no units on the board. There's the blitz 3/3 that gives +2 attack to adjacent units. There's the new one that has revealed this expansion, which is either a 2/6 guard or a 5/3 blitz. France is like steadily getting solid mid-range cards, and this is just going to be another one of them. So it's a 5-cost 5/5 blitz with deployment. Target unit moves into frontline if possible, and this is the same wording as on the card Chasing Shadows, which is a 0-cost order that basically just does this deployment effect. It's choose a target unit, move it to the front line if possible. However, this is a very, very good effect. The only reason it doesn't see play is it's a 0-cost order in an ally nation. However, sticking that card text onto a very good body, a 5-cost 5/5 blitz body, this card is really, really good because you can do one of two things with it. You can use it to immediately pull a unit from the opponent's support line to the front line and trade into it with the Chasseurs. So, they have a Sexton, pull Sexton to the front line, kill it. They have a 0-4 Signal Regiment, pull it to the front line, kill it. Or you can play this and push another unit you have to the front line, and then also push this to the front line as just like a sort of a tempo swing. So, for example, you're playing US-France mid-range, and maybe the previous turn you played a Sherman, and you have the Sherman in the support line, and it costs 2 to operate, so you don't really want to push it this turn. Well, what do? You play Chasseurs, push Sherman to the front line, and then push Chasseurs to the front line. And you essentially just cheated 2 credits. You pushed a 5-5 to the front line for 6 credits. That's an all right thing. And then you cheated 2 credits by pushing Sherman with it. This is just a very, very good effect all around. It's very versatile. And this fits perfectly into the France mid-range archetype that I'm hoping is going to be I think it's going to be a minimum of a tier 2 deck in sort of covert operations. I think the tier 1 echelon is going to be sort of gate capped by self-credit denial. At the moment, but hopefully after a round of nerfs, we can see French ally mid-range decks starting to push into the meta, like starting to push into high tier 2, low tier 1 levels. Maybe it sees play in tournaments. I know I'm going to be trying out a lot of this, and Chasseurs is going to fit straight into that deck. This deck is really, really good, and I'm glad it's moving towards tempo plays rather than just sort of playing Rima, playing like these slow mobilized guys, these big statted guys, and hope they don't get removed. This is far, far better than that. Then we have 2 Finnish cards to look at. The first one is Friendly Fire, which is a 2-cost Finnish countermeasure. Standard rarity. When an enemy unit attacks, it deals its damage to a random enemy. So, this is a bizarre effect. So first of all, to make things clear, 1, this is not combat. This is not attacks a random enemy. So the unit that is attacking is not receiving damage. Now, if it attacks into a unit, I'm not sure if it takes the damage, because the way it's worded, again, it's not saying that combat doesn't happen, it's just saying that the damage it would deal in combat, instead of being dealt to the target you selected, is dealt to a random target on your side. And that random target cannot be the unit that is attacking. So, if this is the only unit you have on board and you attack, Friendly Fire triggers, the damage is dealt to your HQ, but it could be dealt to a different unit. So this is just a really weird countermeasure that I think we're all going to have to see how it plays out, to see how it works. In general, I think this is not going to be good enough to see play. This seems just worse than Cold Trap, because Cold Trap, for the same credits, you can just destroy the unit attacking. Whereas this is deal damage to something, and that is not that good. And yeah, it's just not consistent enough to be good, and there are better options in Finland, and Finland as an ally nation is already very competitive for its slots. This is just not good enough, but, it's a countermeasure that you're going to have to learn to play around, because sometimes it will lose you games, and it will be very, very funny for your opponent, and very, very frustrating for you. Then, the last card we are looking at here today is Depot Raid, which is a 4-cost Finnish order. Send target enemy unit to owner's hand, add a salvaged copy to your hand. So this is most comparable to Underground State, which is the Polish 4-cost order, retreat an enemy unit, summon legions. This is send unit to owner's hand, salvage it, like not destroy it, but add a salvaged version of it to your hand as well. And I've seen a lot of people saying this card's really, really good. I've seen a lot of people saying this card's really, really bad. I think it's in the middle. You're running this in a dedicated salvage deck. That's very clear. You're not running this as a tempo card. Because there's simply... The issue with this card is, if you're trying to run this as a tempo card, 1, there's just better options, if that's exclusively what it is. There is just simply better options. Like, even within Finland, if you're trying to use this as a tempo card, get rid of a big guard, just play White Death. But the second thing is, if you're trying to use this to get a good deployment effect, you're trying to steal a really strong deployment effect from your enemy, the only way to get that is by returning it to their hand, which then gives them access to that deployment effect. So unless you are using that deployment effect on that turn to win the game, you're just giving it to your opponent again, with the bigger body. So this is really a dedicated salvage deck card, where you are trying to use the salvage unit, the salvage copy you get, to either trigger scrap metal or play it as a 4/4 with the 61st Infantry. Like, you're trying to use this as a tempo card that generates salvage. And your deck needs to be able to use the salvage, and it needs to be able to use the tempo. The issue is, this just seems worse at both of those things than Frozen Assets most of the time. Because Frozen Assets, for 5 credits, it costs 4, but then it costs 1 to operate. You get a 1/1 Sisu, which destroys anything it attacks, and it has salvage. So essentially, it is 5 credits, destroy any enemy unit, salvage it. This is 4 credits, return it to hand and salvage it. So for 1 extra credit, you would much rather destroy the unit than return it to hand most of the time. Obviously, there is some issues with how I describe Frozen Assets, because sometimes there's a unit behind guard that you can't attack with the unit. Sometimes it's a unit in the support line and you don't have the front line to be able to use Frozen Assets to attack something into the support line. So there is situations where Frozen Assets is worse, but I feel like Frozen Assets is better often enough that you're never really going to want to run Depot Raid. However, it is not a terrible card. If you could run, like, 15, 16 Finnish cards, I think maybe you would run a Depot Raid or 2 in sort of these dedicated salvage decks. There's situations where it's fun. Like, best case scenario would be Dragon Slayer. They play Dragon Slayer, you retreat it to hand, now they replay it as a 4/3 because it's lost its veteran effect, but you get the 1/1 version that you can now play as a 6/4, because it's the first time you play it. Best case scenario for Depot Raid is on a Dragon Slayer, but obviously, despite how popular Dragon Slayer is, that's not going to happen frequently enough for you to want to run this card. But that brings us to the end of part 4 of my card reviews for Covert Operations. I'm going to be doing probably one more part on June 10th, maybe June 11th, once all of the remaining cards are revealed. If there's too many remaining cards, maybe I'll break it into 2 parts, but probably one more part. But something I do want to say is that tomorrow, on Sunday the 9th, at noon EST, or 1600 UTC, I'm going to be revealing 2 new cards on this channel in a video. It's going to premiere at noon, so be here to watch the premiere. I'm very excited about that, and as soon as the video ends, I will be launching a live stream where I'm going to be giving away like codes to get packs. So if you want some packs, if you want to see what the new cards are, if you want to see my thoughts on those new cards, be here tomorrow, Sunday the 9th, at noon EST. And otherwise, thank you very much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know what you think of these cards in the comments, or join my Discord to continue the conversation over there. Feel free to donate if you have the means to do so. Thank you very much to everyone who has donated, and I will catch all of y'all in the next one.